12 October 1952. Port of Hamburg, Kaischuppen 64. A man in a raincoat and cap leans over his notebook while the winch groans. He writes one line. It is a dangerous line in its honesty. 1952. Port of Hamburg. I have loaded tanks, relief packages, and now washing machines. The cranes never ask whose side they're on. His name was Karl Meyer. He was 40. He had worked the docks under 3 flags. That was the arithmetic of his life. 3 flags. 1 skyline of cranes. A ledger that kept changing currencies and slogans but never paused. 3 May 1945. Hamburg capitulates. British troops of the 7th Armoured Division and the 53rd Welsh Division surround the city. The last German commander, General Albrecht von Patay, surrenders without a fight. It spares streets that have already been broken twice. First by fire, then by hunger. The occupation report in the British files calls it a city of ruins. The mathematics of bricks was simple. Hundreds of thousands of apartments destroyed since the air raids of 1943. Operation Gomorrah had turned night to day, then day to dust. Bundles of household goods lay along the canals. The brick heaps are inventory. The women who clamber over them, stacking, cleaning, saving, are a workforce without a payroll. In German, they will be called Trümmerfrauen, rubble women. It makes them sound organized, like a movement. It was survival. Karl had been a stevedore before the war. He had loaded coal and timber in the Weimar years, then artillery and canned meat for the Wehrmacht. A worker without party rank could be spared the draft if someone needed his muscles. He had a damaged lung from 1943. The firestorm left more than ash in his chest. His father had not come back from the east. The date by his mother's ceramic stove was the day the letter arrived, 12 February 1945, somewhere near the Vistula. His younger brother had been made a Luftwaffe auxiliary, a Flakhelfer, at 17. He disappeared in April. Postcards stopped. Many families had ledgers like this, missing lines with names. In the first days of the occupation, the British stamped their order onto paper and walls. Curfew at 2100 hours. Surrender of all weapons. No gatherings larger than 5 people. No Nazi insignia. Do not fraternize with Allied soldiers. The most grotesque aspect is that we must control and feed this population, reads a British officer's note in an Allied intelligence summary from May 1945. Their obedience is erratic, and their pity for themselves is immense. The cranes stood over the docks, skeletal and still. Their cables were cut in places. Their hooks hung low like defeated swords. Ships were gone or sunk. The warehouses had been hit. Rats owned the quays. The river moved regardless, carrying lobs and silt and rumours. Karl walked the perimeter of the harbour on his first day out after surrender. At the Sandtorhafen, he saw British military police where German harbour police used to stand. Their red caps looked like paint drops against the grey. He had cigarettes. He did not smoke. Cigarettes would become numbers on a ledger. The arithmetic of calories was written on ration cards. In the first months, rations were set by category. Heavy labourers, Schwerarbeiter, received more calories. Office workers, less. Children, little. The Allied Control Authority published charts, curves of calorie levels for Berlin, for the British zone, for the American zone, for the American zone. For Hamburg, the numbers sank in the winter of 1946-47. Reports speak of 176 calories per day, then sometimes 800, 900. That winter froze the Elbe. The newspapers used the word Kohl-Ruben winter, the turnip winter. People burned furniture, doors, branches cut off from parks, and the shrines of their lives. The coal trains were late, and when they came, they went to factories or British barracks first. Karl's work card certified him as heavy labour. Schwerarbeiter, Hafenarbeiter in metal ink. It meant extra grams of meat that were almost mythical. The scale of survival was exact. A black market kilo weighed a month of dentistry, or a night with an American in a club. Cigarettes became money. Good brands were merciless in their value. Lucky Strike and Chesterfield ruled. Players and senior service came in with the British. Their smell became the smell of barter. Aluminum pots were traded for a stack of American tobacco, which became a pair of shoes, which became a doctor's appointment. The mathematics of the black market was solved on the street, not in any ministry. The police, many relieved of their badges for party membership, learned new gestures. A slip of a packet under a coat could make two men conspirators or enemies. People went on hamsterfahrten, hamster trips, to the countryside to trade in secret with farmers. Hamsters hoard. That was the joke, and the accusation. Occupation reports in the archives tell of nocturnal movements on the Altona-Lüneburg road, of town women with empty suitcases returning with sacks of potatoes. The British tried to interdict. It was a losing war. An internal document from the Control Commission for Germany, British element, notes dryly, "Food problem equals security problem. Morality decreases in inverse proportion to hunger. Morality decreases in inverse proportion to hunger." Between the rules, other realities surfaced. Displaced persons camps. DP camps appeared in schools, barracks, and fenced lots. Bergen-Belsen, 70 kilometers south, turned from a site of death into a site of life. Jewish survivors married, had children, staged plays, learned English, waited for papers. In Hamburg itself, camps at Wentorf, Bartenfeld, and Poppenbüttel housed Poles, Ukrainians, Latvians, and others who had been brought as forced laborers. Allied intelligence summaries record clashes between German civilians and DPs over firewood or access to markets. Some Germans shouted that the past was done. The DPs wrote letters to the UNRRR demanding respect. "We toiled here not by choice." A Polish committee letter from the Poppendorf transit camp reads, "We will not take orders from Germans." There were other camps. Neuengamme, just southeast of the city, had been a concentration camp. After 1945, the British used it intermittently as an internment center for suspected war criminals. The photographs are in the Bundesarchiv. Humber bridges, watchtowers, barbed wire that looks like it cannot cut anymore. Hamburgers who said nothing had to see it, at least in pictures, sometimes in pictures, sometimes in person. In the months after the surrender, British units ordered civilians to collect bodies and clear sites where victims lay. "We saw. Not all believed. Some chose to believe other stories," writes a clergyman in an occupation report from June 1945. "The arithmetic of denial has its own numbers. The fewer the witnesses, the lighter the memory, the more the starving mouths at home, the simpler the starving mouths at home, the simpler the story one tells at the table." Karl had hauled bags of cement and crates of machine parts in 1942 for Blom and Voss. He had seen people in striped uniforms moved under guard near the shipyards. He said nothing then. Most men said nothing. Some told the story later, as if they had been under a spell. Some did not tell it at all. Denazification came with a questionnaire. 31, 50, sometimes 131 questions. It depended on the zone and the month. The British zone's forms were shorter than the American zone's later tribunal paperwork. The U.S. military government's law, number 8, and the German run. Spruchkammern under the March 1946 Law for Liberation from National Socialism and Militarism classified Germans into 5 categories: Hauptschuldig, major offenders; Belastete offenders; Minder belastet, lesser offenders; Mitläufer followers; and Entlastet, exonerated. The British zone used similar concepts but a more administrative process. Germans produced Persilscheine, Persil certificates, statements by neighbors or respected citizens that washed them. The metaphor of soap was not accidental. Denazification files in the Staatsarchiv Hamburg show the staccato rhythm of self-description. Joined the party in 1937 to keep my job. Never wore uniform. Attended cultural evenings only. Was conscripted as blockwart but did not report anyone. Signed papers without reading. Gave to Winterhilfswerk. Sent son to Hitler. Youth because all boys went. Mitläufer, it became the most common verdict. The mathematics of guilt in practice. Of the millions of cases opened in the Western zones, only a small fraction were labelled offenders. An even smaller fraction saw prison. In Hamburg, as elsewhere, the need for skilled administrators, teachers, engineers and police officers pressed against the desire for justice. A British intelligence summary from 1947 states plainly, "We require stability more than thoroughness." The myth of total cleansing is not supported by the realities of running a city. That sentence could not be printed in newspapers. It lives in the archives. A port cannot rebuild on shame alone. It also needs cranes. The British sent light cranes and generators. They requisitioned warehouses. They parked tanks where sugar sacks had been. They ordered Germans to work certain shifts and banned them from others. His first British master in the harbour had a scar and a pipe and said little. He wore the Union Jack on his sleeve. The swastika had swung over those wharves once. Now the British flag flapped on masts and headquarters. Later, a tricolour would appear on municipal buildings, black, red, gold. In the harbour's arithmetic of banners, the cranes were indifferent. A hook swung goods under each flag. Iron did not argue. The new municipal government regained a little voice. In March 1946, Max Brauer, a social democrat returned from American exile, became the first mayor of Hamburg. He visited rubble sites and ration offices and told people that the city would eat before it would argue. "Wir brauchen Brot, nicht Parolen," he said in one speech documented in Bundesarchiv records. "We need bread, not slogans." People cheered from hollows between ruins. A political life resumed, but it was supervised. The British military government bent campaign posters that used forbidden words. They allowed elections but edited the ballots. It was common knowledge that Germans expelled from the East were arriving by the trainload. This is a polite phrase. The reality was evident at Altona station, a smell of old hay and fear, and a platform lined with bundles and children who had never seen the city before. The expellés had labels: the Silesians, the Sudeten Germans, the East Prussians. The state created categories and programs. Lodging authorities assigned apartments. There was a term, Zwangseinweisung, compulsory allocation. The arithmetic of rooms was done in the hallway, administered by men who had been clerks before. You have one room too many. The state is sending you a family. A widow who had lost her husband in Stalingrad now lost her spare bed to a woman from Breslau who had lost 2 children on the road. Oral history recordings are full of anger without villains. "Sie nehmen uns auch noch die Wohnung," one Hamburger said. "They take our apartment too." It is in the recordings, with the hiss of tape and the pause at the word Wohnung. The expellé she was speaking about answers later in the same interview, "I did not take. I was placed." The tension was dense, and not only in Hamburg. Schleswig-Holstein, by 1946, had nearly a third of its population composed of expellees. The arithmetic of scarce rooms, scarce jobs, and scarce bread. This arithmetic is not moral. It is the math of resentment. From a distance, it appears like a spreadsheet. From within a cold kitchen, it is a mother's whisper to a child to be quiet, or they will be sent out. Care packages began arriving in 1946. American relief. The brown boxes were objects of awe. A package could weigh 5 or 10 kilos. The contents read like a fable: coffee, sugar, spam, chocolate, dried milk, sometimes even canned fruit. There are photographs of opening ceremonies in schoolyards. A teacher stands with a care box on a table, a British sergeant to her side, 100 children looking like they are at communion. Max Brauer wrote letters of thanks to a city in New York that had adopted a Hamburg district. The politics of gratitude filled newspapers. A postcard addressed simply to Care Package People and dated 7 October 1946 from a Ilse K. widow reads, "I cried when I saw the chocolate. My boy is 9. He has never tasted it." On the same day, British soldiers patrolled a black market at the corner of Schulterblatt and Susannenstrasse. A heavy labor dock worker like Karl could buy the same chocolate there for a week's ration of bread. Cash was useless when there was nothing to buy. The currency was cigarettes, and then, after 20 June 1948, the currency was new. 20 June 1948. Currency reform. There is a geometry to certain dates. They angle the path of everything after. The Deutschen Mark, the DM, arrived like a wind. In Hamburg, people lined up to receive 40 marks in crisp bills. The occupation currency and Reichsmarks in drawers became wallpaper. Shops that had been bare became full overnight. It was not magic. The goods had been hidden, waiting for a number worth counting. The black market collapsed because arithmetic turned public again. The mathematics of cigarettes folded on itself. At Kaiserkai, Karl watched a store window fill with shoes. He went in and held a pair that did not feel like lies. He paid with new paper. The feeling that an hour's labor could be measured reliably began to return. He and his wife, Anna, made a list in pencil. It was the first honest list in years. Shoes, sugar, a new pot, a bit for coal. Then the lines blur. The British will say, in retrospective reports, that the reform went better than expected. The Americans called it a triumph of policy. The people called it the moment money came back. In the rubble city, that mattered as much as justice. The cranes set to work. Ships came again. With them came Marshall Plan cargo. The Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program, was a schedule, a philosophy, and a photography campaign. Boxes marked ERP lined the docks with new characters on their stencils: tractors, lathes, wiring, fertilizers in sacks that smelled like seaweed. A British occupation report states Hamburg harbour throughput increasing by 20% quarter-on-quarter since Q1 1948. The phrase is bloodless. That is how it had to be. Karl loaded crates with labels like Singer and Fordson. He recognized some machines as those that had been dismantled from German factories and shipped to the UK in 1946. This was a joke the workers told carefully: "We send away the brains and get back the limbs." But the flow had changed direction. Dismantling slowed. The British needed German industry to run. The Cold War was not yet cold everywhere, but it was colder than the winter had been. The calculus in Whitehall moved. The new line was security through prosperity, not through paralysis. Berlin cut the country in half, then made two halves into other shapes. June 1948 again. The Soviet blockade of Berlin. The airlift. The planes flew from Wunstorf, Celle and Fassberg and other airfields, not from Hamburg, but the port fed them. Coal sacks arrived on trains marked with chalk. Flour from ERP shipments went to bakeries, whose bread went onto trucks, whose loads went into planes. In the docks, some men quoted numbers with pride. 1,000 flights a day, 8,000 tons, a plane every 3 minutes. The arithmetic of lift and landing cheered men who had counted graves. In cold, the sound of reciprocating engines can be faith. Karl wrote a small line in a notebook in 1949. I have worked 24 years now. I have loaded goods under 3 flags. He did not show it to anyone. He had learned there are sentences that call down questions. The crane cables whined. The dock shouted. Men's voices disappeared. New syllables appeared. Bison, Trison, Bundesrepublik. The British moved their headquarters south. A West German state was declared in Bonn in May 1949. The Basic Law did not have the word Reich. The newspaper in the break room said Adenauer and Erhard. The SPD in Hamburg denounced dismantling and social injustice. The CDU in Bonn promised prosperity for all. Denazification was still on paper. On the ground it was over. The Spruchkammern dissolved or turned into boards for formalities. Law 31 of 1951 restored pensions and posts for many civil servants. The mathematics of guilt settled into a fiscal measure. The teachers who had been removed in 1945 returned. The policemen who had denazified in 1945-1946 now filled in traffic forms. The harbour official who had overseen labour assignments in 1942 stood again in the dispatch office in 1952 with a new pin in his lapel. Denazification files for these men write the same phrase in many hands, Mitläufer. The arithmetic of guilt and stability balanced into a ledger of routine. There were exceptions. A few were prosecuted for crimes committed in war. Many were not. It would take another generation to resist equilibrium. In the schools, the textbooks changed. Late 1940s schoolbook approvals in the British zone emphasized liberal democracy, the rule of law, and the evils of dictatorship. Photographs of Hitler were small, often headshots with captions of caution. The poetry of martyrdom and destiny was excised. The lesson plans for Hamburg schools added a unit on bomb damage and rebuilding before a unit on National Socialist injustice. The pedagogical arithmetic makes sense when written in minutes per week. A class has so many hours. A city has so many scars. The guilt belonged to an old generation, the suffering to the new. The balance was not just. And then there was memory as a civic festival. The commemoration of the air raids gathered Hamburgers in the summer. The name Gomorrah was said like a dear enemy's, reverently. The flyers for these memorials stressed nothing but the dead. Speeches called down rain from 1943. No one mentioned the slave laborers who died building the same ships. A Bundesarchiv photo shows wreaths at a ruined church in 1953. The card titles it, Remembering the Victims of Bombing. The inner caption reads nothing else. Not everyone chose silence. In Staatliche Pressesachen, the files from the Hamburg press office in 1951 and 1952 show pamphlets about Neuengamme, authored by survivors, about which the city council took no position. An Allied officer had said 5 years earlier that Germans would need to be taught how to think again. That is a sentence made of arrogance and despair. It is also unhelpful. People learned how to do paperwork first. That is what a city needs. On the docks in 1952, the cranes were not metaphors. They were machines with worn electromagnets and whooping brakes. They hoisted tanks for British units heading from the port to training grounds. They lifted huge crates of washing machines with German names now, Constructor, AEG. The dockers joked with new words. "We are unloading prosperity," one said. "Not me," Karl answered, but not aloud. He remembered unloading confiscated radios in 1941. He remembered loading crates marked with the names of French cities to be sent to German homes. He remembered British soldiers telling him not to look the girls in the face. He remembered the DP camp fences and the faces within. He had no single story that made sense of it all. The port was the best teacher he had. It taught mass, leverage, and corruption. It taught him how goods move when governments and morals change. A pier is a ledger annotated by tides. On a Monday, he would unload machinery that would rebuild a bombed factory. On Tuesday, he would load crates bound for the Saar, then under French control. On Wednesday, he would help British sappers move armoured cars from ships heading to the Rhine. On Thursday, he would supervise a consignment of care packages, their tags reading, "From the people of Portland, Oregon." On Friday, he would pick up his pay in marks, count his vouchers, and hold back 6 cigarettes for the work week's last shift. On 17 June 1953, the radio reported workers' protests in East Berlin and other towns in the German Democratic Republic. Tanks were used against workers. In Hamburg, some men shut off the engines for a minute and listened. Karl thought of all the tanks he had loaded since 1939. The ones with swastikas, the ones with red, white, blue roundels, the ones painted green and anonymous, the ones painted green and anonymous. The cranes did not pause. He noted the date in the book he kept under the mattress. He did not write a sentence next to it. The files of the denazification court in Hamburg for a man named F.A., an engineering supervisor at the port, show that he was categorized in 1947 as minder belastet, lesser offender. He had joined the party in 1933. In the room at the Spruchkammer, he presented 3 Persilscheine, 2 from neighbors who had borrowed sugar from his wife during the war, 1 from a Jewish woman who said he once hid her boy for 2 nights. It is a story with 2 numbers, 12 years of party membership, 2 nights of hiding. The court wrote him as lesser. He resumed his post in 1950. He liked to say, very softly, that he had done what he could. The mathematics of guilt will never make this an equation. The mathematics of expulsion never balanced either. Between 1945 and 1950, around 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe into the new Germany. West German records show around 7.9 million were in the Federal Republic by 1950. Schleswig-Holstein's population grew by nearly 33% with expellees. Hamburg absorbed fewer by percentage than the countryside, but more than could comfortably live. The welcome was bureaucratically sincere and socially frayed. The law created categories: Vertriebene, refugees; Heimatvertriebene, people driven from their homeland; Umsiedler, resettlers. Each required paperwork. Each promised something the city could not deliver fully: work, housing, schooling. In the files at the Hamburg Housing Office in 1947, there is a pencil map of a 3-room flat in Ottensen. It shows where the state intended to place 3 families, how many beds would be in each room, and which cupboard would be assigned to whom. The cupboard lines are smaller than the doorways. It is possible, with enough ink, to pretend that things will fit. Contact with victims never became a single moment, the kind that films show. It came in glimpses. A small yellowing announcement in a 1945 newspaper about the burial of unnamed camp victims. The reparations debates that began in the early 1950s with words like Wiedergutmachung, making good again, printed without irony in titles of laws. In 1952, the West German government signed an agreement with Israel, the Luxembourg Agreement, promising payments for the costs of resettling Jews and for the crimes committed. In Hamburg, the council debated quietly how to erect a small memorial at Neuengamme. It took decades. The DP camps closed slowly, and some of the people who had been behind fences emigrated. Some stayed, frail and angered, in the city that had housed them badly. For many Germans, the past remained a headline, a topic for the end of conversation. In Karl's case, it was a suspect look from a Polish man with a scar unloading on the next pier. He did not say a word to him. The man did not speak to him either. Their work, the language of wait and signal, made talking unnecessary. It also made forgiveness structurally irrelevant. The Cold War made allies and severed lines. The British zone became North Rhine-Westphalia, Lower Saxony, and Schleswig-Holstein. And the city made itself federal again, a land with a parliament. The British withdrew a bit more each year. The stars and stripes replaced some of their insignias as Americans took more of the military presence. The cranes hoisted crates painted with three-letter codes that meant nothing to men who could not look beyond the wharf, then carried inward machine parts whose names they could not pronounce. They named their kids with pre-war names. They voted. Many drank. Many joined unions that regained voice. The harbour union bargains in Hamburg are in the Bundesarchiv, not the wages, which were better, but the strike threats that won them. There was a slow narrowing of shame into personal quirks. A man who had been very loud in 1941 now stood at the back of union meetings and shifted his feet. A woman who had had a Nazi party card for a cultural club now preferred to report on the neighbourhood's unpaved streets. An engineer kept his iron cross in a drawer with socks. A school teacher required reading Thomas Mann and Goethe and held a unit on the misuse of youth in dictatorship that had his students whispering about their parents. The 1950s were a time of smoothing, the economics good enough to allow it. The country's growth rates were real. A term, Wirtschaftswunder, was minted by a weekly magazine, then used by politicians like an amulet. At the port, the numbers read like ballast. Hamburg's harbour throughput in 1950 exceeded pre-war levels. Orders flowed to shipyards, Blom and Voss, Howeltswerk, Sturken, where men had built U-boats under one flag and now built refrigerated freighters under another. They used suppliers who had adjusted their letterheads, but not their pedigrees. The cranes lifted a brand of washing machine that could handle heavy loads. It was a detail the dockworkers believed mattered. To put a family's dirt in a rotating drum was progress. It was also a way for the city to put soot somewhere else than lungs. Karl became a foreman in 1951. The badge was a small metal oval. It meant he had to fill out more forms and blow a whistle that no one heard. It meant he could ask for an extra man on a job and sometimes receive him. It meant he had to write a line when a crate fell and broke, indicating whether it hit a worker's foot or not. His past was not asked. It was in his jawline and his knuckles. It was not in his papers, which said SPD, dues paid, and reservist training, none. He kept notebooks. Some of the pages contain single dates. Others contain sums. It is the closest thing he had to a confession. Under 24 December 1946, he wrote, Reuben. Anna cried. We had a candle for R. The candle and R are for the brother who did not return. On 20 June 1948, he wrote in blocked letters, NEW money. On 12 October 1952, he wrote a sentence that sounds like a thesis because he had seen enough. 1952, Port of Hamburg. I have loaded tanks, relief. The cranes never ask whose side they're on. On an afternoon in 1952, a British officer supervised a load of armoured cars bound for exercises in Lüneburg Heath. As the cranes worked, a box of car packages split and tumbled. Chocolate bars slid like tiles across the pier. A glance of hunger ran through the men who had known hunger. No one moved. The relationship to chocolate had changed, but the discipline had not. 2 hours later, crates of washing machines were lifted aboard an outbound freighter destined for Gothenburg. Someone laughed. We export cleanliness now. This laughter is in the oral history of a man in the Union Library in Wilhelmsburg, recorded in 1981. He speaks the sentence without triumph or disdain. He follows it with, I can tell if a load is off by 200 kilos in the dark. That is the kind of statement men trust themselves to make with pride. The bureaucracy continued. In 1953, Karl received a letter from the municipal office about a memorial plaque. A soldier's name from his block would be inscribed at the church. The letter asked for confirmation of spelling. He did not respond the first time. He responded the second, writing back with two corrections: the brother's middle name, his father's date of death. He did not ask that another name be added, a neighbor whose party uniform he had once admired as a boy. The arithmetic of memory is cruel when it asks you to compute love in a unit of remorse. By the late 1950s, the port had new cranes, higher and angular, and a new language of containers began to whisper on the docks. Some men died, crushed or drowned, with their paperwork in their pockets. Their names appear in union minutes as Herr M. fall from height. They disappear from family photos and reappear in cemetery registers. The city writes itself into ledgers and memorial stones. There is one interrogation report from 1945 that bears revisiting. It is from Public Safety Branch, Hamburg, 3 December 1945. The officer writes, "Subject states he joined the party in 1937 to keep his job. Claims no knowledge of crimes. When asked about camp, says, we all heard rumors. Attitude, compliant, practical. This is a maddening description. It tells you everything and nothing. It has the tone of a man writing late at night who does not like Germans and does not hate them either. It has the tone notes of a city, compliant, practical. This is another form of confession. Contact with Jewish survivors shifted from the camps to the courtroom when the first trials resumed in German courts. In the 1960s, the major trials in Frankfurt and elsewhere put faces and procedures to crimes, but that is later. In the 1950s, there were granular proceedings, thefts, informers, a guard here, a petty bureaucrat there. A Hamburg court in 1952 convicted a man for denouncing a neighbor in 1942. He had sent her to prison for listening to foreign radio. The sentence was 2 years. The newspapers put the story on page 3. The mathematics of justice no longer had the space of a front page. For those who lived through it and worked through it, the mathematics of survival hardened into the mathematics of interest rates. The dockers negotiated wages by cost of living tables. The city posted rent controls, then loosened them. The banks put up their new glass. The cranes pumped and complained and then quieted. A famous flood came in 1962 and the city remembered the river could still tell it where to go. Karl went with his union to sandbag and did not write that down. He put a hand on the shoulder of a man who had lost a child and did not write that down either. He had learned a rule. Anything that feels like decent action needs no notation. Anything that smells of defense does. The 3 flags in Karl's life were not evenly spaced. The swastika had been total, painted on his schoolbook's opening pages and on the end of his street. The Union Jack had been proprietorial, flown at smart angles and then folded and taken away. The black-red gold, hung with dignity and politesse, was in the background in offices and on municipal stationery, restrained by law in the memory of what excess can bring. He did not talk about them. He noted the dates on which they appeared and vanished. He learned to live with silence. Silence about the people in striped clothes near the shipyard. Silence about the shouting from the new SA offices near the Michel Church in 1933. Silence about the night in 1943 when the sky was orange and he was glad that he was on the ground and not under the roofs which turned to fire. Silence about the policeman who came to his house in 1941 and asked why he had not hung a flag outside on a certain day. Silence about the British corporal who smacked a woman in the face for trying to steal coal from a pile and who then laced her fingers with a chocolate bar when no one was looking. Silence about the crate that fell and killed the boy he had trained in 1955. Silence about the letter he received from a man in 1960, written in careful German from Israel, asking for a signature to confirm a work record from 1939, which would help him with a pension claim. He signed it. He did not write a note saying that he was sorry. He did not write a note saying that he was not sorry. He did not write anything. He put a blank carbon of the letter into his notebook. In his house in Altona, above the kitchen table, hung a calendar with saints' days and municipal waste pickup dates. He wrote in pencil on 2 squares each year. The day in April when his brother had disappeared. The day in June when new money arrived. He rarely wrote words on those squares. He wrote numbers. Numbers were honest in their way. They sit like small stones. He had a daughter who came back from school in 1959 with an essay on what democracy means to me. It is not in his notebook.